The sound was not wood, not stone, but a dull metallic scrape that vibrated up through the sole of her boot, a sound that would change everything. It was a note of discord in the dusty silence of the loft, a secret song played on an instrument of buried metal and forgotten time. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The city had been a cage of noise and concrete, a place where sirens composed the nightly lullaby and the scent of exhaust fumes clung to the curtains of their cramped, third-floor apartment. For Sarah, its walls felt like they were closing in, the pressure of rent and unpaid bills a physical weight on her chest. She was in her early 30s, though the lines of worry etched around her eyes made her feel a decade older. A weariness settled deep in her bones that no amount of sleep could cure. Her resilience was a shield, worn but not yet broken, forged in the fires of a life that had taken more than it had given. Her son, Leo, was the quiet center of her world. At 8 years old, he was an old soul in a small body, his observant eyes missing nothing. He rarely complained, finding his solace in the steady, comforting presence of Gus, their aging brown Labrador whose tail thumped a gentle rhythm against the floorboards, a constant, reassuring heartbeat in their tiny home. Sarah's desperation was a quiet, simmering thing. It was in the way she'd stretch a single can of soup into a meal for two, the way she'd mend the holes in Leo's jeans until the patches outnumbered the original fabric, the way she'd stare out the window at the relentless city, yearning for a patch of green, for air that didn't taste of grime, for a place where her son could run without fear. She dreamed of a home, not just a place to live, but a sanctuary, a fortress of stability against the chaos of their lives. That yearning led her to a county auction on a gray, windswept afternoon. The property was a ghost of a farm, a forgotten relic slumped against the rolling hills. The farmhouse leaned like a tired old man, its porch caving in and its roof a ragged patchwork of moss and tar. The crowd was small and skeptical, a collection of weathered farmers and sharp-eyed developers who saw only rot and ruin. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a dismissive gaze, spoke of the place as if it were already condemned. "Lot number 12, he'd bellowed, his voice echoing across the quiet countryside. "A fixer, upper for the brave or the foolish. We're selling the land, folks. The structure is just a bonus pile of firewood." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Sarah stood at the back, the last of her savings, a collection of worn and folded bills, clutched in her hand. The paper felt fragile, almost holy, the sum total of years of scrimping, of sacrificing every small comfort. It was not nearly enough for a down payment on anything respectable. But here, in this place of decay and forgotten dreams, it might just be enough. She smelled the damp earth, the sweet, cloying scent of decay that hung in the air, and felt a strange sense of peace. This was a place that had already hit bottom, could only go up. When the bidding started and stalled at a number that was insultingly low even for this wreck, a tremor went through her. It was an act of quiet desperation, a gamble on the vast, terrifying unknown. Her hand, trembling, rose into the air. A few heads turned, their expressions a mixture of pity and amusement. Leo, sensing the monumental shift in their universe, tightened his grip on Gus's thick fur, his small face a mask of fear and excitement. The auctioneer didn't try to hide his surprise. He called for other bids, his eyes scanning the crowd, but there was only silence. He shrugged, a final, dismissive gesture. "Sold," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "To the lady with more hope than sense." The words should have stung, but they didn't. Sarah knelt, pulling her son into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair. She whispered the words that were both a promise and a prayer, her voice soft against the rustle of the wind. "We're going home, sweetie." Their arrival 2 weeks later was a sobering affair. The long, dirt driveway was a tunnel of overgrown trees, their branches clawing at the sides of her beat-up sedan. The farmhouse, up close, was even more daunting than it had appeared at the auction. The paint was peeling in long, leprous strips, and several windows were jagged, empty eyes staring out at them. The front porch groaned in protest as Sarah stepped onto it, the wood soft and spongy under her feet. The wind whistled a mournful tune through the broken panes of glass, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to echo the emptiness inside. Sarah's heart, which had been fluttering with a fragile hope, sank. The reality of what she had done, the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the task ahead, crashed down on her. This wasn't a home, it was a ruin. She felt a wave of despair so powerful it almost buckled her knees. What had she been thinking? She had traded a cramped but functional apartment for a derelict shell, using every last penny she had. For a moment, she saw only the failure, the colossal mistake that had doomed them. Then she felt a small hand slip into hers. Leo stood beside her, his eyes wide as he took in the dilapidated structure. He wasn't looking at the broken windows or the peeling paint. He was looking at the vast, overgrown fields that stretched out behind the house, a sea of green and gold under the afternoon sun. "Can Gus run out there?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Sarah looked from the house to the fields, and then down at her son's hopeful face. The despair began to recede, replaced by a flicker of her old, stubborn determination. This was for him. This was for the freedom to run, for the clean air, for a life that wasn't confined to 4 crumbling walls in a concrete jungle. She squeezed his hand, her resolve hardening into steel. "He can run all he wants," she said, her voice stronger now. "We both can." They explored the house together, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty rooms. The inside was a time capsule of neglect. Dust lay in thick blankets over everything, and the air was heavy with the scent of mice and mildew. Gus trotted from room to room, his tail wagging with an uncertain curiosity, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the corners, cataloging the history of smells left behind. In the kitchen, a single rusted chair sat in the middle of the floor, a silent testament to the last person who had called this place home. In the living room, the faded wallpaper was peeling away to reveal the dark, wooden slats beneath. It was a daunting canvas, but for the first time, Sarah began to see the possibilities. She could see past the dirt and the decay to the strong bones of the house, to the way the afternoon light streamed through the grimy windows, to the potential for warmth and laughter to one day fill these silent rooms. That night, they slept on a mattress on the floor of the least damaged room, huddled together for warmth, with Gus curled up at their feet like a furry, breathing furnace. The silence of the countryside was a living thing, a stark contrast to the constant din of the city. It was a silence filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl, sounds that were both alien and deeply comforting. Sarah lay awake long after Leo had fallen asleep, listening to the house settle around her. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life. But as she listened to the steady rhythm of her son's breathing and the soft snores of their faithful dog, she also felt a profound sense of hope. It was a fragile, flickering flame in the vast darkness of her uncertainty, but it was there. They had a home. It was broken and battered, but it was theirs. The next few days were a blur of hard, physical labor. Sarah attacked the grime and neglect with a ferocious energy, fueled by coffee and sheer willpower. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and tore down the rotting, mildewed curtains. Leo, in his own quiet way, was a dedicated helper. He carried buckets of water, his small face set with concentration, and wiped down baseboards with a rag, his movements mimicking his mother's. They were a team, a small, determined unit against the overwhelming tide of decay. The house slowly began to shed its skin of neglect, and with each clean surface, each repaired windowpane, Sarah felt her hope grow stronger. It was during their third afternoon, while they were clearing the overgrown yard, that they turned their attention to the barn. It stood apart from the house, a massive, imposing structure with a gambrel roof and weathered, gray siding. It was a character in itself, a silent, brooding giant that seemed to hold the history of the farm within its walls. The great double doors were barricaded by a thick, thorny wall of blackberry canes, a natural fence that had grown wild and impenetrable over the years. The barn was locked, not with a padlock, but by nature itself. It was a mystery, a sealed container of secrets. Sarah felt a pull towards it, a curiosity that was almost as strong as her drive to make the house livable. It represented the unknown, the potential that she had gambled on. What was inside? Old, forgotten farm equipment? A treasure trove of antiques? Or just more dust and decay? The mystery of the locked barn became a symbol of their new life, a challenge to be overcome, a promise of discovery that lay just beyond the thorns. The challenge was a physical manifestation of every obstacle she had ever faced, a tangled, vicious barrier between her and the unknown. The blackberry canes were not merely overgrown. They were a fortress, woven together over decades of neglect. The thorns were like tiny, curved daggers, catching on her clothes and skin, drawing pinpricks of blood that dotted her arms. For 2 days, she had ignored the barn, focusing on the immediate, overwhelming needs of the house. But its silent, brooding presence was a constant pull on her thoughts. Now, armed with a pair of thick gardening gloves she'd found in a rusted shed and a pair of rusty shears, she was ready to lay siege. The sun was high and hot, beating down on her back as she began to snip and pull. The work was brutal. Each cane she cut seemed to be connected to a dozen others, a complex web of woody, thorny limbs. The smell of the crushed leaves was green and sharp, a wild, untamed scent that mingled with the sweat on her brow. Gus, ever the faithful companion, lay in a patch of shade, his head on his paws, watching her with a low, occasional whine as if to question the sanity of her battle. Leo, however, was right there with her. He was too small to handle the shears, but he had appointed himself the task of dragging the severed canes into a pile, his small face a mask of serious concentration. He wore his own pair of oversized gloves, his hands looking like tiny paws, and he'd grunt with effort as he hauled a particularly long and thorny branch away. "We're a good team, Mom," he said, pausing to wipe a smear of dirt from his cheek with the back of his gloved hand. Sarah stopped, leaning on the shears, her muscles aching. She looked at her son, his small, determined form silhouetted against the bright sky, and a wave of love so fierce it almost stole her breath washed over her. He was right. They were a team. The best team, she agreed, her voice a little hoarse. She took a long drink of water from the bottle she'd brought out and then turned back to the wall of thorns. Her initial frustration had given way to a grim, rhythmic determination. Snip, pull, drag. Snip, pull, drag. The pile of discarded canes grew into a small mountain. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and still, they worked. Finally, with a last mighty heave, Sarah pulled away a thick, gnarled section of the thorny barricade, and for the first time, they saw the doors clearly. They were massive, made of thick, weathered planks of wood, held together by straps of rusted iron. A heavy, iron latch, frozen with rust, was all that held them closed. There was no padlock, no modern sign of security, only the ancient, stubborn resistance of time. "We did it, Leo," Sarah breathed, a triumphant smile breaking across her tired, dirty face. Leo cheered, a small, happy sound that was quickly joined by a series of excited barks from Gus, who had trotted over, his tail wagging furiously now that the tide of the battle had clearly turned. The latch, however, proved to be a new enemy. It was fused shut by decades of rain and rust. Sarah pulled and pushed, her gloves slipping on the cold iron, but it wouldn't budge. "We need a bigger tool," she muttered, her mind racing. She remembered seeing a crowbar in the same shed where she'd found the gloves. She retrieved it, the heavy iron bar feeling cool and powerful in her hands. She wedged the tip into the space between the latch and the doorframe and put her weight into it. The wood groaned in protest. The metal shrieked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, satisfying crack that echoed across the quiet farm, the rust gave way. The latch sprang open. A cloud of red dust puffed into the air. Sarah and Leo stood back, their hearts pounding in a shared rhythm of anticipation. This was it, the moment of discovery. Sarah took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and dry, ancient hay. She put her shoulder to the massive door and pushed. It resisted, scraping against the stone threshold. And then, with a low, deep groan, it began to move. A sliver of darkness appeared, and from it rushed a wave of air, cool and musty, carrying the scent of a century of stillness. It was the smell of earth, of time itself, of things long forgotten. Sarah pushed harder, and Leo joined her, his small body adding its weight to the effort. Gus pushed his nose into the growing gap, sniffing with an intense, quivering curiosity. The door swung inward, its groan deepening into a long-drawn out sigh as it opened into the cavernous dark. They stood on the threshold, peering into the gloom. The interior of the barn was a vast, shadowy space, far larger than it had appeared from the outside. Shafts of late afternoon light cut through the dusty air, piercing the darkness through cracks in the siding and the roof. The light beams were thick with dancing motes of dust, like golden pillars holding up the high, vaulted ceiling. The silence inside was profound, a heavy, weighted quiet that seemed to absorb the sounds of their own breathing. It was a cathedral of forgotten work, a monument to a life that had long since passed. Old farm equipment, draped in thick, intricate tapestries of cobwebs, stood like ghostly sculptures in the dim light. A rusted tractor, its tires long since rotted away, sat in the center of the floor. A plow, its metal blade still showing a faint gleam, leaned against a wall. Stalls lined one side of the barn, their wooden gates hanging open, waiting for animals that would never return. Sarah felt a sense of awe mixed with a touch of fear. It was like stepping into a photograph, a moment frozen in time. She took a hesitant step inside, her boots crunching on the dirt and straw that littered the floor. Leo stayed close to her side, his hand clutching the fabric of her jeans, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "It's so big," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the immense quiet. Gus, however, seemed to feel no such trepidation. He trotted confidently into the center of the barn, his nose to the ground, his tail giving a few slow, thoughtful wags. He was reading the history of the place, a story written in the faint, lingering sense of hay, animals, and earth. Sarah and Leo began to explore, moving slowly through the shafts of golden light. They ran their hands over the rough, weathered wood of the stalls, their fingers tracing the deep grooves and marks left by generations of livestock. They peered into old barrels and crates, finding them filled with nothing but dust and dried leaves that had blown in through the cracks. Everything was covered in a thick, soft blanket of gray dust, which muted every color and softened every edge. It was a place of profound and solemn beauty, a testament to the slow, relentless power of nature to reclaim what man had made. In the far corner, a wooden ladder, its rungs worn smooth with use, ascended into the shadows of the loft above. Sarah looked up, her eyes trying to pierce the darkness. The loft was another layer of mystery, a space even more hidden, more secret than the ground floor. The pull of the unknown was irresistible. "I'm going to see what's up there," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast space. "Stay here with Gus." Leo nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark opening above. He didn't look scared, just intensely curious. He sat down on an overturned bucket, pulling Gus closer, his hand resting on the dog's broad, comforting back. The ladder was rough and splintery, but it felt solid under Sarah's hands and feet. She climbed slowly, the scent of old, dry straw growing stronger with each rung. The air in the loft was warmer, trapped under the high roof, and even thicker with dust. As her head rose above the level of the loft floor, she paused, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The loft was filled with hay, great, slumped bales that had settled and compressed over the years, looking like soft, misshapen furniture in the gloom. A single, round window at the far end of the gable allowed a circle of soft, diffused light to filter in, illuminating the space with a gentle, ethereal glow. She pulled herself up onto the floor, her boots sinking slightly into the thick layer of loose straw that covered everything. The silence up here was even deeper, more absolute. It felt like a sacred space, a place no one had entered for a very, very long time. She took a few steps forward, the straw rustling around her ankles, and it was then that she heard it. The sound was not wood, not stone, but a dull metallic scrape that vibrated up through the sole of her boot, a sound that would change everything. It was a note of discord in the dusty silence of the loft, a secret song played on an instrument of buried metal and forgotten time. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. She froze, standing perfectly still, listening. There was only silence. She took another tentative step, deliberately placing her foot in the same spot. Again, the sound, a solid, unyielding scrape beneath the soft cushion of straw. It wasn't a rock. It was flat, large. Something was hidden here. Kneeling down, she began to clear the straw away, her hands moving with a frantic energy. The straw was dry and brittle, breaking apart in her fingers, releasing a cloud of dust that made her cough. She worked faster, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her anticipation a tight knot in her stomach. The straw was thick, piled deep, but she could feel the hard outline of something large and rectangular beneath it. Her fingers brushed against a coarse, rough surface, and then cold, hard metal. She cleared the last of the straw away, her hands raw and covered in scratches, and stared at what she had uncovered. It was a trunk, an old, style trunk, bound with iron straps and covered in what looked like a thick, black layer of tar pitch that sealed it shut. It was huge, at least 4 feet long and half as wide, its surface dark and forbidding. In the center of the lid, gleaming dully in the soft light from the window, was a small, rectangular brass plate. Sarah leaned closer, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She wiped the dust from the plate with the sleeve of her shirt, the metal cool against her skin. Engraved into the brass in elegant, looping script were a set of initials. She squinted, tracing the letters with her finger. EAW. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was not just some forgotten piece of farm equipment. This was a deliberate act of concealment. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this trunk, to seal it against the elements and the passage of time. It was a secret, a heavy, solid secret, and she had just stumbled upon it. "Mom!" Leo's voice floated up from the barn floor below, small and concerned. "Are you okay?" Sarah couldn't find her voice for a moment. She swallowed, her throat dry. She looked from the trunk to the dark opening of the loft, her mind reeling with the implications of her discovery. This was real. The hope she had been so carefully nurturing, the fragile dream she had gambled everything on, it had just taken on a solid, tangible form. "I'm okay, sweetie," she called down, her voice trembling slightly. "I found something." She remained on her knees for a long moment, her hand resting on the cold, hard surface of the trunk. It felt like she was touching history, a direct link to the person who had lived here before, to the secrets they had kept. A profound sense of destiny settled over her, a feeling that this was no accident, that she had been led to this place, to this exact spot. From the moment she had raised her hand at the auction, she had been following an invisible thread, and it had led her here, to this dusty loft and the promise it held. Leo's face appeared at the top of the ladder, his eyes wide and questioning. He climbed the last few rungs and came to kneel beside her, his gaze fixed on the immense, dark chest. "What is it, Mom?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Sarah looked from the trunk to her son's innocent, hopeful face, and she felt a fierce, protective surge. Whatever was in this trunk, it was going to change their lives. She didn't know how, but she knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. She put her arm around his small shoulders, pulling him close. "I don't know, honey," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "but I think it's something important." Together, they knelt before the immense, dark chest, a silent monument to a forgotten life. The air in the loft was thick with the ghosts of memories, and the single, round window cast a halo of light around the trunk, making it seem less like a piece of furniture and more like an altar. The initials E.A.W. seemed to shimmer in the dusty light, a cryptic signature on a masterpiece of concealment. Getting it open would be another war. The tar pitch that sealed the lid to the base was not just a coating. It was a thick, black, unyielding weld. It had been applied hot, and over the decades, it had hardened into a substance as unforgiving as stone. Sarah ran her gloved finger over the seam. It was smooth, seamless, a perfect, dark line with no obvious point of weakness. She thought of the crowbar, still lying on the barn floor below. It had been their key to the barn itself, a tool of brute force against the stubbornness of time, and it seemed fitting that it should be the key to this final secret. She left Leo guarding the trunk, his small hand resting on its coarse surface as if to keep it from vanishing, and descended the ladder. When she returned, the heavy iron bar in her hand, her resolve had hardened. This was no longer just a discovery, it was a right. They had earned this. The acrid smell of old tar filled the air as Sarah jammed the tip of the crowbar into the seam. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort, but the seal held fast. The metal tip just scraped against the hardened pitch, sending up a small puff of black dust. It was like trying to pry open a solid block of iron. "It's too strong," she panted, stepping back, her arms trembling from the strain. Leo looked from the trunk to his mother, his brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe we need to chip it," he suggested, his voice quiet but clear. "Like with ice." Sarah looked at the trunk, then at the crowbar. He was right. A direct assault was useless. She needed to be methodical. She found a heavy, rusted hammer in the same shed where she'd found the other tools, and using the crowbar as a chisel, she began to tap at the tar seal. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was dull and unsatisfying at first, but she persisted, her movements rhythmic and focused. A small chip of black tar flew off. Then another. It was slow, painstaking work. Leo watched, his chin resting on his knees, his gaze unwavering. Gus had somehow sensed the shift in gravity and had managed to climb the ladder, his claws scrabbling for purchase, and now lay panting softly a few feet away, a furry, reassuring presence in the tense silence. An hour passed. The pile of black, brittle chips on the floor grew. Sarah's arms ached, and her hands were numb, but a thin, jagged crack was beginning to form along the seam. With a final, forceful blow, a large section of the tar broke away, revealing the rusted iron hasp and lock beneath. It was an ancient, heavy thing, its mechanism long since seized. There was no keyhole visible, only a solid face of rust. There would be no picking this lock. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah wedged the crowbar under the hasp and, with Leo counting down, 3, 2, 1, push! She threw her entire weight against it. The wood around the hasp groaned, splintering. The old iron shrieked in protest. And then, with a deafening crack that sent a flock of startled pigeons bursting from the rafters, the hasp tore free from the wood. The lock fell to the floor with a heavy thud. Silence descended once more, broken only by their ragged breathing. It was done. The trunk was unlocked. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to still them. She looked at Leo, whose eyes were as wide and round as saucers. He nodded, a silent, solemn permission. Slowly, reverently, she placed her hands on the lid of the trunk. The wood was rough and cold beneath her palms. She took a deep breath, held it, and lifted. The lid was heavy, but it moved, creaking on its ancient iron hinges. It opened with a long, low sigh, releasing a wave of air that smelled of cedar, old paper, and something else, something crisp and clean, like money. For a moment, they could only stare, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. The trunk was full. It was filled to the brim with neatly stacked, paper, banded bundles of cash. The bills were old, the portraits of Benjamin Franklin looking stern and unfamiliar. They were packed so tightly there was barely a sliver of space between them. It was an impossible sight, a pirate's treasure in a farmer's barn. Leo let out a soft, choked gasp. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. Is that real?" Sarah couldn't answer. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the top bundle. The paper was crisp, real. She lifted it. It was heavy, solid. The band around it was brittle with age and printed with the words $1,000. She looked back into the trunk. There were hundreds of such bundles. Hundreds. Her mind, which had been reeling, suddenly sharpened. The fog of disbelief pierced by the sharp point of calculation. She started counting the stacks, her lips moving silently. 10 stacks across, maybe 20 deep, and the trunk was at least 4 layers high. Her breath hitched. Couldn't be. The number was too fantastical, too absurd. She picked up another bundle and then another. They were all the same. $100 bills. A quiet, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. It was the sound of a mind breaking free from a lifetime of limitations. She sank back on her heels, the bundle of money still clutched in her hand. "I think so, sweetie," she finally managed to say, her voice a strange, high-pitched thing she didn't recognize. "I think it's very real." She did a rough, conservative estimate in her head, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Even if her math was off, even if she was wrong by half, it was still a fortune. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of, more than she could have earned in 10 lifetimes. It was freedom. It was safety. It was a future for her son. It was $7 million. Beneath the top layers of cash, nestled in a hollowed-out space, were other treasures. The first thing Sarah lifted out was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded, blue silk ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink a faded sepia. Next came a thick, leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with use. And at the very bottom, lying flat, was a small, framed photograph. They moved the items into the circle of light from the window, the bundles of money lying in a growing, unbelievable pile around them. The immediate, overwhelming shock of the cash began to recede, replaced by a deeper, more profound curiosity. The money was the what. These items, these relics of a forgotten life, were the why. Sarah carefully untied the blue ribbon, her fingers fumbling slightly. She unfolded the first letter, the paper so fragile it threatened to crumble in her hands. The handwriting was elegant, a looping, feminine script that spoke of a bygone era. She began to read aloud, her voice soft in the quiet loft, Leo leaning against her, his head on her shoulder. The letters were from a man named James, and they were love letters, filled with a passionate, poetic longing. He wrote to his dearest Eleanor, his hidden star, his secret garden. He wrote of meeting her in secret, of stolen moments in the woods and whispered promises under the moon. It was a story of a forbidden love, a deep and passionate connection that had to be hidden from the world. The diary, Eleanor's diary, told the other half of the story. Sarah opened it to the first entry, dated in the spring of 1952. Eleanor's voice, silent for more than 70 years, emerged from the pages, as clear and strong as if she were sitting there with them. She wrote of James, a hired hand on her father's farm, a man with kind eyes and a gentle soul, a man her wealthy, domineering father considered beneath them. She wrote of her love for him, a love that was as vast and untamed as the fields around her. "He does not see the land as father does," Sarah read from the diary, her voice thick with emotion. Father sees only profit, acres to be tamed and sold. James sees the soul of it. He speaks of the way the light falls in the morning, of the language of the trees. He is a poet, and I am his only audience. As Sarah read, the story of Eleanor and James unfolded. They planned to run away together, to use the money Eleanor had secretly inherited from her grandmother to buy their own small piece of land far away from her father's disapproval. The money in the trunk was their escape fund, their hope for a new life. But the story took a tragic turn. James fell ill, a sudden, swift sickness that the doctors in their small town couldn't diagnose. Eleanor wrote of her frantic, desperate attempts to save him, of spending her own money on specialists from the city, of nursing him day and night. The last letter from James was a short, scrawled note, his handwriting weak and shaky. "My Eleanor," it read, "do not grieve. Find the sun. Live the life we dreamed of. I will be waiting for you in the light." He died a week later. The diary entries that followed were filled with a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight in the loft. Eleanor wrote of a world that had lost its color, of a silence that was filled with the ghost of his laughter. Her father, seeing her grief as a weakness, became even more controlling, determined to marry her off to a man of his choosing, to merge their land with another wealthy family. "He wants to erase James," Eleanor wrote, her elegant script now jagged with anger and pain. He wants to pretend he never existed. But I will not let him. I will keep him alive in here. The money, their escape fund, became a secret memorial. She could not bear to spend it. It was tainted by the dream that had died with James. So she hid it. She sealed it in the trunk, a time capsule of their love and their lost future, and concealed it in the loft of the barn, the place where they had shared so many of their secret meetings. She resolved to live a solitary life, a quiet rebellion against her father's wishes. She never married. She inherited the farm after her father's death and worked it herself, a strong, solitary woman in a world of men. The last entry in the diary was dated nearly 40 years after James's death. The handwriting was frail, but the spirit was unbroken. "The world has changed so much," she wrote. But the land remembers. The barn remembers. I am old now and my time is near. I wonder what will become of this place, of my secret. I hope, with all my heart, that whoever finds it is in need of a new beginning. I hope it finds its way to someone with the courage to start over, to find the sun, just as my James asked of me. I leave it not as a treasure, but as a legacy of a love that was stronger than time. Sarah's voice broke on the last words. Tears were streaming down her face, silent, hot tears for a woman she had never met, for a love story that had ended in heartbreak but not in defeat. She felt a profound, aching connection to Eleanor, to her resilience, her quiet strength, her fierce protection of the one pure thing in her life. In Eleanor's story of loss and survival, Sarah saw a reflection of her own struggles, of her own desperate fight to create a safe harbor for her son. Finally, Sarah picked up the small, framed photograph. She wiped the dusty glass with the hem of her shirt and turned it to the light. It was a faded, sepia-toned portrait of a young woman, her hair styled in the fashion of the early 1950s. She was not smiling, not exactly, but there was a light in her eyes, a quiet strength in her gaze that was both sad and defiant. It was Eleanor. She looked exactly as Sarah had pictured her. Leo leaned in, his small finger gently touching the glass over Eleanor's face. "She's pretty," he said softly, "but she looks sad." "She was," Sarah whispered, pulling him into a hug, her tears dampening his hair. "But she was strong, too. Very strong." They sat there for a long time, in the dusty, golden light of the loft, surrounded by an impossible fortune and the lingering spirit of a woman who had left it behind. The shock and disbelief had given way to something far more complex. It was a feeling of overwhelming gratitude, but also of immense responsibility. This wasn't just a lottery win. It was an inheritance in the truest sense of the word, a legacy passed from one woman who had fought for her independence to another. It was a gift from the past, a key to the future. Sarah looked around the loft, at the piles of money, at the open diary, at the faded photograph in her hand. She thought of Eleanor's final wish, for the money to find someone with the courage to start over. A shiver went through her. It felt as if Eleanor had been speaking directly to her, across the vast, silent expanse of 70 years. She had gambled on a forgotten farm, and in doing so, she had stumbled into a forgotten story. Now, that story, and the incredible fortune that came with it, was hers. The weight of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time since she had driven down the overgrown lane to this dilapidated farmhouse, she felt not just a flicker of hope, but the bright, blazing light of a new dawn. Eleanor had asked her to find the sun, and here it was. The first few days after the discovery were a dream, a surreal, sun-drenched haze of disbelief and dizzying possibility. The $7 million, a number so vast it felt like a fiction, sat in its dark, heavy tomb in the loft, a sleeping dragon of a secret. Sarah found herself climbing the ladder a dozen times a day, just to lift the lid and stare, to reassure herself that it was real, that she hadn't imagined the crisp stacks of bills in the dusty light. The story of Eleanor and James had woven itself into the fabric of the farm, and Sarah felt their presence everywhere, in the sigh of the wind through the eaves of the barn, in the stubborn resilience of the old apple trees, in the quiet strength of the house itself. The money was no longer just a windfall, it was a sacred trust, a responsibility to honor the love and loss it represented. But a secret of that magnitude could not stay hidden forever. A dragon, once woken, cannot be willed back to sleep. The practicalities of their situation began to assert themselves. They couldn't live on hope and Eleanor's memory alone. The farmhouse needed a new roof, new windows, a furnace that didn't rattle like a dying man's last breath. Leo needed new shoes. The first step, the most terrifying and necessary step, was to take the money out of the barn. Sarah chose a small, independent bank in a town 20 miles away, a place where she hoped to remain anonymous. She packed 2 large, sturdy duffel bags with the bundles of cash, a weight so significant it felt like she was carrying solid gold. The drive was a blur of paranoia. Every car that passed on the quiet country roads seemed to be watching her. Every shadow held a potential threat. When she finally walked into the quiet, marble-floored bank, she felt like an imposter, a child playing dress, up in her mother's clothes. The bank manager, a kind, silver-haired man named Mr. Gable, led her into his office when she explained, in a trembling whisper, that she needed to make a large deposit. When she unzipped the bags on his polished mahogany desk, his professional composure evaporated, replaced by a look of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. The story she told him was a heavily edited version of the truth, a simple tale of a forgotten family inheritance found in an old trunk. She omitted the details of Eleanor's diary, of the $7 million, speaking only of a significant sum. But in a town where the biggest news was the annual bake sale, the deposit of even a fraction of that amount was an earthquake. News, like water, always finds a crack. A teller whispered to her husband, who mentioned it to his brother over a beer, who told his wife, and by the end of the week, the story had morphed and grown, spreading through the county like wildfire. The quiet, desperate single mom who had bought the old, derelict farm had found a treasure. The whispers varied. Some said it was $100,000. Others claimed it was $1 million. The truth, in all its staggering reality, remained her secret, but the damage was done. The world now knew, and the world, in its insatiable curiosity and greed, was coming. The arrival came on a Tuesday, a week after the bank deposit. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn afternoon. Sarah was on the porch, teaching Leo how to properly hammer a nail into a loose floorboard, the rhythmic tap, 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 a comforting sound in the peaceful air. Gus was asleep in a patch of sun, his paws twitching as he dreamed. The sound began as a low hum, a noise that didn't belong to the countryside. It grew steadily louder, resolving into the purr of a high-end luxury engine. A sleek, black sedan, so polished it reflected the clouds, turned into their overgrown driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel with an arrogant disdain. It looked like a panther slinking into a chicken coop. The car pulled to a stop a few feet from the porch, and the driver's side door opened. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He was tall and thin, with a pale, narrow face and hair so perfectly coiffed it looked like a helmet. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes sweeping over the dilapidated farmhouse, the peeling paint, the half-repaired porch, with an expression of profound distaste. He looked at Sarah, in her smudged jeans and old T-shirt, as if she were just another piece of the decay. Leo, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in the atmosphere, stopped hammering and moved to stand behind his mother, his small hand gripping the back of her shirt. Gus lifted his head, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. The man ignored the dog, his thin lips curling into a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling sense of predatory satisfaction. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked, his voice smooth and condescending, the sound of money and entitlement. Sarah's heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. She wiped her hands on her jeans, her chin lifting in a gesture of unconscious defiance. "I am," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. The man took a few steps closer, his expensive leather shoes looking absurdly out of place on the dusty ground. "My name is Arthur Ainsworth," he announced, as if the name itself should mean something to her. "Eleanor and Weatherby was my great-aunt." The name, Eleanor's full name, hit Sarah like a physical blow. E-A-W, the initials on the brass plate. The dream was over. The nightmare was beginning. "You have something that belongs to my family," Arthur said, his eyes glinting with a cold, avaricious light. He gestured vaguely towards the barn. Sarah felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, chasing away the cold dread. It was the anger of a mother protecting her child, of a guardian protecting a sacred trust. She thought of Eleanor's diary, of her heartbreak, of her final, heartfelt wish. This man, with his expensive suit and his cold, dead eyes, had no part in that legacy. "I have what a woman left behind," she said, her voice low and clear, resonating with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And I'm not giving it up without a fight." Arthur's smile widened, becoming a sneer. "Oh, my dear woman," he said, his tone dripping with false pity. "You have no idea what kind of a fight you're in for." The intimidating atmosphere of the law office was a world away from the sunlit fields of the farm. It smelled of old books, lemon polish, and the dry, papery scent of money changing hands. The walls were lined with shelves of thick, leather-bound volumes, their gold, embossed titles forming a silent, imposing barricade of legal precedent. Sarah sat in a plush leather chair that seemed to swallow her whole, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Gable, the bank manager, had given her the name of a lawyer, a man he described as honest and tenacious. His name was Ben Carter, and he was a large, rumpled man in his late 50s, with a kind, weary face and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He listened patiently as Sarah recounted the entire story, from the auction to the discovery in the loft, to the arrival of Arthur Ainsworth. She had brought Eleanor's diary and the last letter from James, which now felt like sacred texts, her only real connection to the woman who had changed her life. Ben Carter read the documents carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He handled the brittle pages with a surprising gentleness for a man of his size. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest, and steepled his fingers, looking at Sarah over the top of them. "This is quite a story, Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "In 30 years of practicing law, I can't say I've ever heard one quite like it." "Is it my story, though?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Or does it belong to him? To Arthur?" "That," Ben said, leaning forward, "is the $7 million question, isn't it?" He explained the legal complexities in a way she could understand. The money was what the law called mislaid property. Since she had found it on property she legally owned, she had a strong claim, likely the strongest claim. However, Arthur, as a blood relative, could also make a claim, arguing that it was a lost family asset that should revert to the estate. "His argument is weak, but not without merit," Ben explained, his expression serious. "He'll argue that Eleanor never intended to give the money to a stranger, that her diary is just the sentimental rambling of an old woman, not a legal document. He'll try to paint you as an opportunistic squatter who got lucky." The words were harsh, but his tone was not unkind. He was giving her the unvarnished truth. "What are our chances?" Sarah asked, her stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. Ben was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Honestly, it's a coin toss. It will come down to a judge, to how they interpret Eleanor's intent. The diary is powerful emotionally. It establishes a clear narrative. But it's not a will. A good lawyer, and you can bet Arthur has the best, will tear it apart. This will be a long, expensive, and very public fight. He's counting on you not having the resources or the stomach for it." The initial joy of her discovery, the pure, unadulterated hope, felt like a distant memory. It had been replaced by a grim, exhausting reality. The money, which had promised freedom, had instead become a cage, a source of fear and constant, grinding pressure. "I have to fight," Sarah said, her voice gaining a measure of its earlier strength. "I'm not just fighting for the money. I'm fighting for her. For Eleanor. I can't let him erase her story." Ben Carter studied her face, and a slow, small smile touched his lips. "Good," he said, a new warmth in his voice. "That's what I was hoping you'd say, because I believe in her story, too. And I think a judge will as well. Now, let's get to work." The legal battle began, and the conflict spilled out of the courtroom and into the small, tight-knit community. The town, which had at first been a source of quiet support, became a landscape of shifting allegiances and whispered judgments. The story of the farmhouse treasure was no longer a charming local legend. It was a bitter, public feud. Sarah felt the change every time she went into town for groceries. The whispers followed her down the aisles of the general store, a rustling, invisible tide of speculation. Some of the townspeople, who had known her only as the quiet woman who was fixing up the old Weatherby place, now looked at her with a new, hard curiosity in their eyes, as if trying to see the $7 million on her person. Others looked at her with open resentment, their faces tight with an envy that was as sharp and bitter as the winter wind. Arthur Ainsworth had been busy. He had given an interview to the local paper, portraying himself as the grieving nephew, seeking only to honor his family's legacy, which had been stolen by a fortunate stranger. He was charming, well-spoken, and utterly believable. He painted Sarah as a greedy opportunist, a narrative that found fertile ground in the hearts of those who felt left behind by life. The community was divided. There were those who sided with Arthur, who saw the world in terms of bloodlines and birthrights. To them, Sarah was an outsider, an interloper who had no right to the Weatherby fortune. They were the ones who would turn their backs when she entered a room, whose children were suddenly too busy to play with Leo. Then there were those who stood with Sarah. They were the farmers who understood the value of hard work and the courage it took to start over. They were the mothers who saw in Sarah a reflection of their own struggles and their own fierce love for their children. They were the ones who would offer a supportive smile in the post office, who would leave a basket of fresh vegetables on her porch, who would tell her to keep her chin up when they passed her on the street. One of her staunchest supporters was a woman named Mary, a weathered, no-nonsense farmer in her 60s who lived down the road. She had stopped by one afternoon, her truck rattling up the driveway, and handed Sarah a warm, freshly baked apple pie. "Don't you let them get to you," Mary had said, her eyes kind but her voice firm. "This town's got a good heart, but it's got a jealous streak a mile wide. You just keep fighting. You're doing what's right." The support of people like Mary was a lifeline, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. But the pressure was immense. Sarah tried to shield Leo from the worst of it, to maintain a sense of normalcy for his sake. But children are barometers of the emotional weather. He saw the strain in her face, heard the worry in her voice when she spoke on the phone to Ben Carter. He stopped asking when they could finish fixing the porch, when they could paint his room. The joy of building their new home had been overshadowed by the fight to keep it. The farmhouse, which had been a symbol of hope and new beginnings, now felt like a fortress under siege. The initial, blazing light of her discovery had dimmed, replaced by the grim, flickering candlelight of a long and uncertain battle. The fear and anger were a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The injustice of it all gnawed at her. But every time she felt her resolve begin to crumble, she would climb to the loft, open Eleanor's diary, and read. She would read of Eleanor's love, her loss, and her quiet, unbreakable strength. And in the pages of that diary, she would find her own. She was no longer just fighting for herself and her son. She was fighting for Eleanor's legacy, for the right to find the sun. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the countryside, once a comfort, now felt vast and menacing, a canvas onto which she projected all her fears. The legal battle had stretched into weeks, then a month, and the farmhouse, her sanctuary, had begun to feel like a gilded cage. The weight of Ben Carter's words was a constant pressure in her chest. "It's a coin toss. It will come down to a judge. to how they interpret Eleanor's intent. The diary was their heart, their emotional core, but Arthur's lawyers were chipping away at it, dismissing it as sentimental fiction, legally meaningless. They needed more. They needed proof, something cold and hard and undeniable, something that could stand up to the withering scorn of a cross-examination. So Sarah searched. Every night, after Leo was asleep, his small face peaceful in the soft glow of his nightlight, she would begin her ritual. She would make a pot of strong coffee, light a single candle on the old oak kitchen table, and open Eleanor's world. Gus would settle at her feet, his heavy sighs a comforting counterpoint to the frantic ticking of the old wall clock. The kitchen would be filled with the rustle of brittle paper and the faint, sweet scent of dried ink and cedar. She wasn't reading for the story anymore, not for the heartbreak or the love. She was a detective now, a cryptographer searching for a hidden message in a text she knew by heart. She pored over the diary, her eyes tired but her mind sharp, scanning each line, each word, for a hint, a clue, an anomaly she might have missed in her earlier, more emotional readings. She studied the letters from James, tracing his passionate script, hoping for a secret code, a hidden meaning in his poetic prose. She held the pages up to the candlelight, looking for invisible ink, for any sign that Eleanor had left more than just her story. But there was nothing. The pages held their secrets close, offering only the beautiful, tragic narrative she already knew. Despair began to creep in, a cold, familiar fog. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe this was all they had. Maybe it wouldn't be enough. One night, her hope worn thin, she was about to close the diary for what felt like the 100th time. Her fingers brushed across a page in the middle of the book, an entry from the winter of 1953, just a few months after James's death. It was a page filled with a grief so raw it was painful to read. But as her fingers traced the lines, she felt something, a subtle difference in the texture of the paper. She stopped, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump. She ran her fingertips over the page again. Most of the page was smooth, the ink long since dried into the fibers of the paper. But one paragraph, a short, seemingly insignificant passage about the bitterness of the cold and the way the frost clung to the window panes, felt different. The ink there was slightly raised, the paper beneath it subtly warped, as if it had been written with more pressure, or perhaps with a different pen. She angled the page towards the flickering candlelight. The ink in that one section was infinitesimally darker, a blacker, more decisive shade than the faded sepia surrounding it. It was a detail so minor, so easily overlooked, that she had read past it a dozen times. But tonight, in the desperate quiet of the late hour, it screamed at her. Her heart began to race. This was it. This had to be it. She read the passage again, her eyes devouring the words, searching for their hidden meaning. "The cold is in the bones of this house," Eleanor had written. Asterisk, "it seeps from the stones. I feel it most when I am near the hearth, the heart of this home. But a heart has its secrets. A fire's warmth is a promise, but its deepest heat is buried in the foundation, where the first stone was laid and the truest intentions are kept." Asterisk, "a fire's warmth is a promise, but its deepest heat is buried in the foundation, where the first stone was laid." The words echoed in her mind, a riddle wrapped in a lament. The hearth, the massive stone fireplace in the living room, a structure so large it was the architectural center of the house. The heart of this home. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked up from the diary, her gaze fixed on the dark doorway that led to the living room. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a hammer blow of anticipation. Could it be that simple? Could the clue have been there, right in front of her, this whole time? A surge of adrenaline, potent and dizzying, washed away her exhaustion. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the wooden floor. Gus lifted his head, his ears perked, sensing the sudden shift in her energy. She grabbed a flashlight from a kitchen drawer, its beam cutting a nervous, trembling path through the darkness as she walked into the living room. The fireplace was a behemoth of river rock and dark mortar, dominating the far wall. It was cold and silent now, its black, cavernous opening like a mouth holding its breath. Sarah knelt before it, the stone cold against her knees. The beam of her flashlight played over the rough, uneven surfaces of the rocks. Where the first stone was laid, she started at the bottom, running her hands over the foundation stones, pushing and prodding, feeling for any looseness, any sign of a hidden mechanism. The mortar was solid, the stones unmoving, locked together for a century. Her initial burst of hope began to wane, replaced by the familiar sting of disappointment. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was just a desperate woman seeing patterns in the dark. She was about to give up when her fingers brushed against the hearthstone itself, the large, flat slab of slate that formed the floor of the fireplace. It was a single, massive piece, and it had always looked immovable. But as her hands slid along the back edge, near the firebox, her fingers dipped into a groove she had never noticed before. It was a fingerhold worn smooth with use. Her heart leaped back into her throat. She pulled. The stone didn't budge. It was too heavy. She needed leverage. She ran back to the kitchen, her mind racing, and returned with the crowbar, the same tool that had opened the barn, that had opened the trunk. It felt like a magic wand, a key to unlocking the farm's secrets. She wedged the tip into the thin crack at the back of the hearthstone and pushed down. The stone groaned, a low, grinding sound of rock on rock. It lifted just an inch, but it was enough. She worked the crowbar along the edge, slowly, carefully, prying the massive slab upward. It tilted, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath. A wave of cool, musty air, the scent of deep earth and time, washed over her. The space was dark, filled with dust and thick, intricate cobwebs that hung like ghostly veils. And in the center of the space, sitting on the packed earth, was a long, sealed envelope, yellowed with age, its edges darkened with moisture. It was wrapped in oilcloth, a final, desperate layer of protection against the damp. Her hands trembled as she reached into the dusty space and lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. She unwrapped the oilcloth, which crumbled in her fingers, and held the envelope. Her name wasn't on it, but she felt as if it were. This was meant for her. This was Eleanor's final message. "Mom!" A small, sleepy voice came from the doorway. Leo stood there, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up in every direction. He had been woken by the noise. Gus stood beside him, his tail giving a slow, uncertain wag. "What are you doing?" Sarah's throat was too tight to speak. She held up the envelope, a silent offering. Leo's eyes widened. He walked over and knelt beside her, his fear forgotten, replaced by the same intense curiosity he'd shown in the loft. Together they looked at the envelope. The wax seal on the back was unbroken. It was stamped with the same elegant initials as the trunk, E.A.W. With a deep, steadying breath, Sarah broke the seal. The wax crumbled, releasing a faint scent of cinnamon. She unfolded the single, thick sheet of paper inside. It was a formal document, filled with dense, legal language, typed on an old manual typewriter. At the top, in bold letters, were the words, "The Last Will and Testament of Eleanor and Weatherby." Her eyes scanned the page, her heart pounding a frantic, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. She found the key passage, the words that would change everything, the words that would silence Arthur and his greed forever. Her voice was a hoarse whisper as she read them aloud, the words filling the quiet, dusty air of the living room. A final, victorious declaration from a woman long dead. "All the remainder of my estate, including any and all assets, monies, or properties discovered after my passing, I leave not to any blood relative, for blood has been no measure of kindness in my life, but to the future occupant of my home, whomever they may be, provided they are one who has the courage to start over." Sarah's voice broke on the last three words. Tears, not of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming relief, streamed down her face. She had done it. She had found the proof. Eleanor's wish was now a legally binding command. Leo looked from the will to his mother's tear-streaked face. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. He understood the shift in the atmosphere, the release of a tension that had held them captive for weeks. He reached out his small hand and placed it on her arm. "That's you, Mom," he said, his voice soft but certain. "You have the courage." Sarah pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his small shoulder, the will clutched in her hand like a shield. He was right. She had been so focused on the fight, on the fear, that she hadn't seen it. But Eleanor had. Across the chasm of 70 years, another woman who had known loss and loneliness had seen her, had believed in her, and had given her not just a fortune, but a legacy of strength. The quiet triumph was a feeling more profound than the initial shock of finding the money. This was not luck. It was destiny. The farmhouse was no longer a fortress under siege. It was a home, sanctified by a gift from the past. The blazing light of a new dawn, which had been so cruelly dimmed, now burst forth, brighter and more brilliant than ever before. The fight was not over, but now, she knew without a shadow of a doubt, that she was going to win. The courtroom was a hushed, polished world of dark wood and suffocating silence, a place where truth was weighed on scales of rhetoric and procedure. The air was thick with tension, a palpable thing that settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical weight. Arthur Ainsworth sat at the opposing table, a portrait of smug confidence in his immaculate suit. His lips curled into a faint, knowing smirk. His lawyer, a man with a voice as smooth and cold as river stone, had just finished his closing argument, painting a masterpiece of avarice with Sarah as its subject. He had portrayed her as a cunning opportunist, a drifter who had stumbled upon a family tragedy and sought to exploit it for personal gain. He had dismissed Eleanor's diary as the fanciful, legally irrelevant ramblings of a lonely, eccentric woman. The words, though expected, had stung, leaving Sarah feeling exposed and vulnerable under the curious, judgmental gaze of the packed gallery. The town was there in force, a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, their expressions ranging from open support to veiled hostility. Ben Carter rose to his feet, his large frame seeming to fill the space beside her. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that was calming. He did not look at the jury or the gallery, but directly at the judge, a stern, white-haired woman whose expression had remained unreadable throughout the proceedings. "Your Honor," Ben began, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the tense quiet. "Mr. Ainsworth's counsel has painted a compelling picture of greed. He is correct that this case is about greed, but he has mistaken its source." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Arthur's smirk faltered slightly. "For weeks," Ben continued, "we have listened to arguments about bloodlines and birthrights. We have been told that a distant relation, a man who never knew his great-aunt, who never once visited this farm or tended to her memory, has a greater claim to her legacy than the person she explicitly chose. We have been asked to believe that Eleanor Weatherby's most profound and personal writings are meaningless. We have been asked to dismiss her voice." Ben picked up the leather-bound diary from the table. "This diary is the heart of the matter. It is the voice of a woman who loved, who lost, and who, in her final years, contemplated the meaning of her life and her fortune. Mr. Ainsworth would have you believe it is a fiction. But what if it was a map? A map leading not just to a treasure, but to her truest and final intention." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Ben. "Counsel," she warned, her voice sharp, "if you are introducing new evidence—" "I am, Your Honor," Ben said, his voice firm. He turned to Sarah, who reached into the simple canvas bag at her feet. Her hands were trembling as she pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped package. She unwrapped it and handed the yellowed, sealed envelope to Ben. He walked to the judge's bench and placed it before her. This was discovered, sealed, within the hearth of the farmhouse, exactly where Eleanor's diary indicated a secret was kept. It is her last will and testament, signed, dated, and notarized in the year 1991. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a sudden, breathless vacuum. The only sound was the faint crinkle of paper as the judge broke the 70-year-old wax seal. Arthur Ainsworth had gone rigid in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief, the color draining from it until it was the shade of old parchment. His lawyer stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. The judge unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the typed lines. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. After a long, agonizing moment, the judge looked up, her gaze sweeping from the will to Arthur, and then finally settling on Sarah. Her expression was no longer unreadable. It was one of profound, thoughtful consideration. She cleared her throat. The final article of this document, the judge said, her voice ringing with authority in the silent room, reads as follows. All the remainder of my estate, including any and all assets, monies, or properties discovered after my passing, I leave not to any blood relative, for blood has been no measure of kindness in my life, but to the future occupant of my home, whomever they may be, provided they are one who has the courage to start over. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Sarah felt the tears she had been holding back for so long finally break free, hot and silent, streaming down her face. It was a release so profound it felt like a physical unlocking within her chest. Leo, who had been sitting quietly beside her, his small hand clutching hers, seemed to understand the monumental shift. He threw his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder in a fierce, joyful hug. The judge's gaze softened as she looked at them. The intent of the deceased, she declared, her voice leaving no room for argument, is crystal clear. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Sarah Jenkins. The inheritance is legally and rightfully hers. She banged the gavel, the sharp, definitive crack echoing like a gunshot, signaling the end of the war. Arthur Ainsworth let out a strangled cry of rage, his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He slammed his fist on the table and lunged to his feet, but his lawyer pulled him back, whispering urgently in his ear. Arthur shoved him away and stormed out of the courtroom, his expensive suit a flag of his own humiliation. The gallery erupted into a cacophony of chatter, a wave of relief and celebration from Sarah's supporters. Mary, the farmer, was beaming, giving her a thumbs up from across the room. Ben Carter placed a heavy, comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. She did it, Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor did it. Sarah could only nod, her tears of relief turning into tears of gratitude, for the lawyer who had believed in her, for the friends who had stood by her, and most of all, for the woman she had never met, who had reached across the decades and given her a future. The months that followed were a blur of joyous, chaotic, and deeply satisfying work. The farmhouse, which had stood as a monument to neglect, was reborn. The sounds of hammering and sawing, once a symbol of her solitary struggle, were now the sounds of a collaborative creation, a symphony of renewal. The roof was replaced, its old, tired patchwork giving way to sturdy new shingles. The windows, once jagged, empty eyes, were fitted with new panes that reflected the wide, open sky. The porch was rebuilt, its wood strong and welcoming, no longer groaning in protest but inviting visitors to sit and stay. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust replaced the old, musty smell of decay, a clean, hopeful perfume that permeated every room. The restoration of the house was a mirror to the restoration of their lives. The lines of worry on Sarah's face softened, replaced by the easy smile of a woman who no longer had to choose between paying the rent and buying groceries. The weight of constant financial anxiety, a burden she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it, was lifted. She could breathe again. Leo blossomed in the newfound security. The quiet, observant boy was now filled with a boisterous, carefree energy. He spent his days exploring the fields, his laughter echoing across the open space, with Gus, whose own aging joints seemed to have been rejuvenated by the fresh country air, bounding happily at his heels. When the last of the work was done, Sarah threw a party. It wasn't a grand affair, just a simple gathering on a warm autumn afternoon to thank the people who had stood by them. Ben Carter came, his rumpled suit looking perfectly at home on the new porch. Mary was there, her weathered face crinkled into a permanent smile, along with a dozen other neighbors who had offered support in the form of pies, kind words, and unwavering belief. The house was filled with the sound of laughter and music, the smell of a roasted chicken turning in the new oven, and the feeling of a community that had, in the end, chosen kindness over jealousy. That afternoon, standing on her porch, looking out at the faces of her friends, Sarah made an announcement. She spoke of Eleanor, of her story, of her final wish. She explained that the $7 million was not just a fortune, it was a legacy, and a legacy was meant to be shared. She was using a portion of the money to establish a foundation in Eleanor's name, a non-profit called Eleanor's Courage, dedicated to helping other single mothers and families in need, giving them the same chance she had been given, the chance to start over. A hush fell over the small crowd, and the warmth of their approval was a palpable thing. Ben Carter raised his glass. "To Eleanor," he said, his voice full and clear, "a woman who knew that the best inheritance isn't money, but courage." To Eleanor, everyone echoed, and the clinking of glasses was a sweet, hopeful music. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the fields, Sarah and Leo walked to a small, freshly tilled patch of earth near the barn. In her hands, Sarah carried a young maple sapling, its roots bundled in burlap. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The restored farmhouse glowed behind them, its windows like warm, welcoming eyes, a beacon of safety and belonging. They had come to plant a tree in Eleanor's memory, to put down a new root that would connect the past to the future, a living monument to the love and resilience that had taken hold in this place. Sarah dug a hole in the rich, dark earth, her hands no longer fighting against thorns and decay, but working with the soil, nurturing it. Leo carefully helped her place the sapling into the ground, his small hands patting the earth around its slender trunk with a gentle reverence. They stood back, looking at the small tree, a fragile promise of the shade and beauty it would one day provide. Gus trotted over and gave the sapling a curious sniff before settling down at their feet with a contented sigh. The world was quiet, peaceful. The frantic energy of the past few months had settled into a deep, abiding calm. This was it. This was the life she had dreamed of, a life she had not even known how to dream of. It was a life of peace, of security, of love. Leo leaned against her, his head resting on her hip, his eyes fixed on the little tree. "Do you think she's watching us, Mom?" he asked, his voice a soft whisper in the twilight. Sarah looked from the sapling to the magnificent old barn, then to the house, now a home, glowing with a light that was all their own. She felt a profound sense of connection, a certainty that the spirit of the woman who had made all this possible was woven into the very fabric of this land. She put her arm around her son, pulling him close, and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I think she is, sweetie," she said, her voice filled with a quiet joy. "And I think she's smiling."